Picture this: a 5-year-old girl with golden curls, dressed in the finest silk, standing in a grand palace surrounded by servants who treat her like a little goddess. She has everything a child could dream of: jewels, beautiful dresses, the finest food, and everyone bowing to her every wish. But what if I told you that this same little girl was already doomed to a fate so horrific that it would make your heart break? What if I told you that by the time she turned 21, she would be dead, killed by the very people who claimed to love her most, her own family? This isn't a fairy tale, my dear friends. This is the true story of Princess Margarita Teresa of Spain, a story so disturbing that it will change how you see those beautiful royal portraits hanging in museums forever. Before we dive deeper into this heartbreaking tale, I want to ask you something. If you're finding this story as shocking as I did when I first discovered it, please show your support by hitting that subscribe button and giving this video a like. Your engagement helps me continue bringing you these untold stories of history's forgotten victims. And please share your thoughts in the comments. I read every single one of them. Now, let me take you back to the year 1651, to the golden halls of the Spanish royal palace, where our story begins not with joy, but with a tragedy that was already written in the stars. When baby Margarita Teresa took her first breath on July 12, 1651, the entire Spanish court celebrated. Cannons fired, bells rang across Madrid, and nobles lined up to pay their respects to the newest Habsburg princess. But here's what nobody told you about that celebration. They weren't celebrating the birth of a daughter. They were celebrating the arrival of fresh breeding stock for the royal family. You see, Margarita Teresa was born into the House of Habsburg, a family so obsessed with keeping their bloodline pure that they had been marrying their own relatives for generations. Her father, King Philip IV, was 51 years old and desperately needed political alliances to save his crumbling empire. Her mother, Queen Mariana, was just 22, but she'd already learned the brutal truth about Habsburg marriages. You don't marry for love, you marry your own uncle. Yes, you heard that correctly. Margarita Teresa's parents were uncle and niece, and this innocent little girl, playing with dolls in the palace nursery, was already promised in marriage to another uncle, a man she had never met in a country she had never seen. Can you imagine being that little girl? Playing dress-up, not knowing that every beautiful gown was preparing you for a life of reproductive servitude? Learning to curtsy and smile, not knowing that these were skills to make you more appealing to your future husband, uncle. The Spanish court treated Margarita Teresa like a precious jewel, but not because they loved her. They were polishing that jewel to sell it for the highest price possible. Every lesson she took, every language she learned, every dance step she mastered, it was all designed to make her a more valuable bargaining chip in the deadly game of European politics. By the time she was 10 years old, palace doctors were already examining her body, checking her development like farmers examining livestock. They wrote detailed reports about her breeding potential and reproductive capacity. These documents still exist today, and reading them will make you sick to your stomach. They discuss this child's body in purely functional terms, as if she were a racehorse being prepared for breeding season. Meanwhile, little Margarita Teresa was becoming a beautiful, intelligent young girl. She spoke multiple languages fluently, showed remarkable artistic talent, and had a natural charm that impressed everyone who met her. But these wonderful qualities only made her more valuable as a commodity. A smart, beautiful princess could command a higher price in the marriage market than a plain or dull one. The negotiations for her marriage began when she was just 11 years old. The chosen buyer was Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor and head of the Austrian branch of the Habsburg family. He was her uncle, her mother's own brother. He was 23 years old when they started planning his marriage to his 11-year-old niece. Let me pause here and let that sink in. a grown man in his 20s, was being arranged to marry his 11-year-old niece. And this wasn't considered scandalous or wrong. It was considered smart politics. The negotiations for her marriage were conducted like a business transaction. Spanish ministers emphasized her beauty and intelligence, while Austrian representatives demanded guarantees about her health and fertility. They haggled over her dowry like merchants arguing over the price of grain. At no point was the child herself consulted about her feelings or preferences. The final months before her departure from Spain were filled with intensive preparation. She received detailed instruction in Austrian customs and was repeatedly told about her primary duty as Leopold's wife, producing male heirs to continue the Habsburg line. The message was clear. Your value as a human being is measured entirely by your ability to bear children, preferably sons. On April 25, 1666, 14-year-old Margarita Teresa stood in a Spanish cathedral wearing an elaborate wedding gown, reciting vows to a man she had never met. The Austrian ambassador stood in for Leopold during the ceremony, while the teenage bride went through the motions with the mechanical precision of someone who had been thoroughly trained for this moment, but took no joy in it. Immediately after this proxy wedding, she began the long journey from Madrid to Vienna. For months, she traveled across Europe, displayed to curious crowds like an exotic animal being transported to a new zoo. Foreign diplomats who met her during this journey noted her obvious intelligence and beauty, but they also remarked on something else: her growing anxiety and fear as she approached her destination. When she finally arrived in Vienna on December 6, 1666, the real wedding ceremony took place 12 days later. Leopold, now 26 and 12 years older than his bride, went through the ceremony with distant politeness. Margarita Teresa, wearing another elaborate gown that seemed to swallow her small frame, performed her role with the same mechanical precision she had learned in Spain. And then began the horror that would define the rest of her short life. The Austrian court expected her to become pregnant immediately, and they got their wish. Less than 3 months after her wedding, 15-year-old Margarita Teresa was pregnant with her first child. The court celebrated this as proof that the marriage alliance was already bearing fruit, but the young empress was terrified by the prospect of childbirth at such a young age. What happened next will make you understand why I called this story one of history's most disturbing examples of institutional child abuse. Margarita Teresa was subjected to a rigid routine that controlled every aspect of her daily life. She was essentially imprisoned within the palace, monitored constantly by court physicians who treated her like a breeding animal rather than a human being. Her first pregnancy ended in tragedy when she miscarried after 7 months. The loss devastated her, but the court's response was immediate and cruel. When could she get pregnant again? There was no time for grief, no concern for her emotional recovery. She was expected to conceive again as quickly as possible. And so began a cycle of pregnancy, loss, and immediate pressure to conceive again that would continue until her death. Her second pregnancy also ended in miscarriage. Her third pregnancy finally produced a living daughter, but even this success brought no relief from the reproductive demands placed upon her. By the time she was 19, Margarita Teresa had endured 4 pregnancies, multiple miscarriages, and 1 living child. Her health was failing, she showed signs of severe depression, and court physicians noted that she was frequently ill and exhausted. But the pressure to produce more children, especially male heirs, never stopped. Her Spanish relatives wrote letters expressing concern about her condition, but these concerns were always secondary to political considerations. The Spanish succession crisis was intensifying, making her potential sons even more valuable to the Habsburg cause. No one was willing to risk the dynasty's future for the sake of one young woman's health and happiness. Her 5th and final pregnancy began in early 1672. By this point, her body was clearly failing. Court records describe a young woman who was obviously dying, yet still subjected to medical treatments designed to maintain the pregnancy rather than save her life. The Habsburg system had invested too much in this union to accept defeat, even at the cost of Margarita Teresa's life. On March 12, 1673, 21-year-old Margarita Teresa went into premature labor after months of declining health. The delivery was catastrophic. Both mother and child died in the process, ending a life that had been entirely devoted to serving Habsburg ambitions. The immediate reaction to her death reveals the cold calculations that had driven her entire existence. Rather than mourning the loss of a young woman who had sacrificed everything for the dynasty, court officials immediately began discussing Leopold's need for a new wife who could continue the reproductive work that Margarita Teresa had been unable to complete. Her funeral was elaborate and expensive, but it was designed to demonstrate Habsburg power rather than honor the individual woman who had died in their service. Even in death, she was being used as a propaganda tool for the system that had destroyed her. But here's where this story takes an unexpected turn, and where we find a kind of justice that the Habsburg court never intended. Today, Margarita Teresa is not remembered for her tragic death or her failure to produce enough heirs. She is remembered for her appearance in one of the world's most famous paintings, Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas, painted when she was about 5 years old. This masterpiece hangs in the Prado Museum in Madrid, and millions of people visit it every year. In that painting, Velázquez captured something the Habsburg court never valued: Margarita Teresa's individual humanity. The artist saw her not as a future breeding stock or political commodity, but as a remarkable little girl with intelligence, spirit, and infinite potential. The painting preserves her at the only truly free moment of her existence, before the machinery of royal marriage had claimed her. When modern visitors look at Las Meninas, they see that luminous child gazing directly at them with curious, intelligent eyes. Art historians have noted the haunting quality of her gaze, and I think I know why it affects people so deeply. We're looking at a child who deserved so much better than the fate that awaited her. The painting has become an accidental memorial to all the young women throughout history whose lives were sacrificed to male ambition and political necessity. Every person who admires the intelligence and vitality in that 5-year-old face is implicitly recognizing the tragedy of what happened to her afterward. In a way, Margarita Teresa achieved a kind of immortality that her Habsburg relatives never attained. While their empire crumbled and their bloodline failed, she lives on in one of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. The system that valued her only for her reproductive function has been forgotten, but the painting that captured her essential humanity will be admired for centuries to come. The irony is profound and beautiful. The girl who was treated as property became art. The child who was denied individual worth became the subject of infinite scholarly discussion and public admiration. The victim of institutional abuse became a symbol of human dignity and artistic achievement. Her story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. How many children throughout history have been sacrificed to adult ambitions? How many young women have been treated as commodities rather than human beings? How many families have destroyed their own members in pursuit of power and status? The answers to these questions are disturbing, but they're also necessary. Margarita Teresa's tragedy was not unique. It was part of a pattern of exploitation that continued long after the Habsburg dynasty fell and that continues in various forms today. When we remember her story, we honor not only her individual suffering, but also our collective responsibility to protect children from the adult ambitions that would consume them. Her legacy is a warning that no political goal, no matter how grand, justifies the sacrifice of innocence and human dignity. That golden-haired child in Velázquez's masterpiece gazes across the centuries with eyes that have seen too much, serving as an eternal witness to both the heights of human artistic achievement and the depths of human cruelty. In remembering her story, we ensure that her sacrifice was not entirely in vain. The next time you see a royal portrait in a museum, remember Margarita Teresa. Remember that behind every political alliance and dynastic marriage was a real human being whose life had value beyond their utility to the state. Remember that the price of power is often paid by those who never chose to pay it. And perhaps most importantly, remember that in a world that tried to reduce her to a reproductive function, art gave her back her humanity. That's the real power of great art. It sees the individual worth that political systems so often ignore, and it preserves that worth for future generations to recognize and honor. Margarita Teresa of Spain died at 21, but in Velázquez's Les Meninas, she remains forever 5 years old, forever curious, forever full of the potential that the world denied her. That's not just artistic genius, that's justice, painted in oil and preserved for eternity.